Let me tell you something about the morning of my son's wedding. It was supposed to be the kind of day that gets framed, the kind that grandchildren hear about 40 years from now over Sunday dinner. The flowers were right. The weather was cooperating, which, if you've ever planned an outdoor June wedding in Virginia, you know is nothing short of a miracle from God himself. The venue was beautiful. The caterers were on time. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, except my wife. I noticed it first because Maggie is never quiet in the morning. The woman has narrated every sunrise of our 31 years together, like she's being paid by the word. She hums while she makes coffee. She talks to the plants. She once held a full conversation with a bird on our windowsill and seemed genuinely offended when it flew away mid-sentence. So when I woke up that morning, and the room was still, I mean completely still, something in my chest moved before my brain caught up. I sat up. Her side of the bed was empty, sheets cold. The bathroom door was shut. No humming, no running water. No commentary about the weather, or what she planned to wear, or how she hoped Smith remembered to eat breakfast before the ceremony. Just silence. I swung my legs off the bed and walked to the bathroom door. I knocked twice. Light, the way you do when you already sense something is wrong, but you're still hoping you're overreacting. Nothing. I opened the door. And what I saw? I want you to stay with me here, because what I saw in that moment is the kind of thing that rearranges something permanent inside a man. Maggie was standing in front of the mirror, both hands gripping the edge of the sink. Her knuckles were white. She was still in her robe. And her hair, her beautiful silver hair that she had spent the last 2 years carefully growing out, was gone. Not trimmed. Not styled differently. Gone. Chunks of it were sitting in the sink like scattered feathers after a storm. What was left on her head was uneven, jagged, like someone had used scissors the way a child uses scissors. Rushed. Careless. Almost aggressive. She wasn't crying. That's the part that gutted me. Maggie wasn't crying. She was just staring at herself, like she was trying to recognize the woman in the mirror and coming up short. I said, and I want you to notice I said it very quietly, I said, Maggie, what happened? She didn't turn around. She just looked at my reflection in the mirror and said, it was Brianna, flat as pavement. Now, I need you to understand something about me before we go any further. I am not a man who yells. Never have been. My father used to say that a man who raises his voice has already lost the argument. I've carried that my whole life. 31 years of marriage, 17 years as a litigation attorney, and I have never once needed to raise my voice to make a point land. But in that moment, standing in that bathroom doorway, something very old and very quiet woke up inside me. I said, she did this? Maggie nodded slowly. Then she said, she filmed it, John. She was laughing. She called it a prank. I remember that specifically. I gripped it because my hands needed something to do that wasn't what they wanted to do. I said, where is she now? Maggie finally turned and looked at me. Really looked at me, and she said, John, not today. Please, Smith cannot know about this today. And there it was. Even standing in that bathroom looking like she'd been ambushed in her own home, which she had. My wife's first instinct was to protect our son's wedding day. 31 years, and she still finds ways to humble me. I left the bathroom, walked downstairs, and found Brianna in the kitchen. She was eating a yogurt parfait. Casually. The way someone eats breakfast when they have not committed a single crime against another human being that morning. She looked up when I walked in, and gave me a smile so wide it had square corners. She said, good morning, John. Big day, right? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, it is. I poured myself a cup of coffee. She started talking about the centerpieces. I nodded at the appropriate intervals. I said, twice. And the entire time I was studying her, the way you study opposing counsel before a deposition, looking for the seams. Because here's what 17 years in a courtroom teaches you. Guilty people don't act nervous until they realize someone knows. Until that moment, they perform normal. And Brianna was performing hard that morning. She said, is Maggie up? We need to leave for the venue by 11. I said, she's getting ready. She said, oh good. I hope she loves the updo I helped her plan. I told her that style would be perfect for her hair length. And she said it so cleanly, so smoothly. I set my coffee cup down. I looked at her, and I said, still calm, still quiet. I said, Brianna, how long have you and I known each other? She said, almost 4 years now. I said, 4 years. That's a good amount of time to get to know someone, don't you think? She laughed, a little uncertain now, and said, I'd say so. I picked my coffee back up and said, me too. And I walked out of the kitchen. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, John, why didn't you confront her right then? Why didn't you say something? And the honest answer is this. I didn't say anything because I didn't yet know everything. What I knew in that moment was the surface. What Maggie had told me was the headline, but I have spent too many years in too many courtrooms to react to headlines. Headlines are what people want you to see. The story is always underneath. And something, call it instinct, call it 31 years of knowing my wife, something told me that what happened in that bathroom that morning was not the beginning of this story. It was just the first time I'd been allowed to see it. That evening, after the ceremony, after the toasts, after Smith and Brianna had driven away in a car with "Just Married" written on the rear window in white shoe polish, I sat on the edge of our bed and watched Maggie carefully remove what was left of her hair in the mirror. She was quiet for a long time. Then she opened the drawer of her nightstand, pulled out a small brown envelope, and set it in my lap. She said, I've been waiting for the right time to show you this. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at her. I said, how long? She sat down beside me, folded her hands in her lap, and said, very calmly, the way she says everything, she said, 2 years, John. I've been keeping it for 2 years. I opened the envelope, and that was the moment I stopped being a father-in-law and started being a lawyer. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. This is the thing about evidence. In a courtroom, evidence doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your history, your intentions, or the perfectly reasonable explanation you've been rehearsing in your head. Evidence just sits there, quiet, patient, immovable, and it tells the truth whether you're ready to hear it or not. That night, sitting on the edge of my bed, with a brown envelope in my hands and my wife beside me, I learned that Maggie had been collecting evidence for 2 years. 2 years. While I was sleeping next to this woman, while we were having Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, and watching Smith fall deeper in love with the woman sitting across the table from us, Maggie had been quietly, methodically documenting. I pulled the first item out of the envelope. It was a folded piece of paper, a printed screenshot of a text message. I recognized Smith's number at the top. The message was from Brianna, sent to Smith approximately 18 months ago. It read, and I'm going to read this to you exactly as it was written. It said, your mom called again. I didn't answer. You need to talk to her about boundaries or I will. I stared at it. I said, Maggie, when did you call Smith that day? She said, his birthday. I set the paper down on the bed very carefully, the way you set down something fragile or something explosive. I said, she didn't tell him you called. Not that time, not the 6 times after it. I reached into the envelope again. The second item was a photograph, printed from a phone. It showed our living room, taken from an angle I recognized as the hallway, during Christmas 2 years ago. In the photo, Maggie was sitting alone on the couch, while Smith and Brianna stood in the kitchen doorway laughing about something. The timestamp on the photo was 7:43 p.m. I remembered that Christmas. I remembered stepping out to take a call from a client and coming back to find Maggie alone. She'd said she was just resting. I said, who took this photo? Maggie said, I did. I set my phone on the bookshelf, and I took it myself. I said, Maggie, why didn't you tell me? And here is what she said. She looked me dead in the eye, and she said, because you love that boy more than you've ever loved anything in your life, John. And I was not going to be the reason his father looked at his marriage differently before it even started. I had no response to that. 17 years as an attorney, and the woman took the words clean out of my mouth. I reached into the envelope a third time. Now, I need you to stay with me here because this is where the story stops being about a bad daughter-in-law and starts being about something considerably darker. The third item was a card. A greeting card, the kind you find in the seasonal aisle at a drugstore. On the front it said, thinking of you. Inside, in Brianna's handwriting, it said, Maggie, I just want you to know that Smith and I are so grateful for everything you do. You're such a special part of our lives. I looked at it. Then I looked at Maggie. I said, she gave you this? Maggie said, she gave me that 3 days after she told Smith's cousin at Thanksgiving that I was, and I'm quoting, a lot to deal with. I said, she said that? Maggie said, Patricia told me herself. She felt I deserved to know. I set the card down next to the photograph, next to the text message screenshot. I looked at the three of them lined up on the bed like Exhibit A, B, and C, and I felt something shift behind my eyes. Because here is what a lawyer sees when he looks at that combination. He doesn't see a difficult daughter-in-law. He sees a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, do not develop overnight. Patterns are built, intentionally, brick by brick. I reached into the envelope again. There were 11 more items. I won't walk you through every single one, because we'd be here until Tuesday, but I'll give you the highlights. And I use that word with tremendous sarcasm. There was a screenshot of a comment Brianna had left on a neighborhood Facebook group, under a fake profile name which Maggie had traced back to her through a mutually shared photo, describing an unnamed neighbor as the kind of older woman who makes every family gathering about herself. Posted 2 days after Easter. Our Easter, there was a voicemail transcribed by hand in Maggie's neat cursive because she'd accidentally deleted the audio. From Brianna to Smith, intercepted on our home phone during a visit when Brianna had dialed the wrong number. In it, Brianna told Smith that his mother had made a comment about the wedding flowers. No such comment had been made. Maggie hadn't said a single word about those flowers. I know because I was sitting right next to her when the subject came up. There was a birthday card Maggie had received from Smith last year. The one she'd cried about. The one she'd told me was the sweetest thing he'd ever written her. I'd seen her fold it and put it in her jewelry box. What I hadn't known, what I was learning right now at 11 o'clock at night on my son's wedding day, was that the card Smith thought he'd mailed himself had actually been pre-written by Brianna. Maggie had found the draft on a notepad in their guest room during a visit. Same words, Brianna's handwriting, Smith's signature. She had written her husband's love for his mother and handed it to him to send. I put that one face down on the bed. I said, "Does Smith know any of this?" Maggie said, "No." I said, "Does anyone?" She said, "Just Patricia, and now you." "Why are you showing me this tonight?" She was quiet for a moment. She reached up and touched the uneven edge of her hair. Just briefly, just her fingertips. And then she put her hand back in her lap. She said, because this morning was the first time she did something she couldn't hide. Everything else she did in corners, John, in whispers. Things I couldn't prove without looking paranoid. But this morning she stood in our bathroom and she laughed. On camera. And she uploaded it before I could ask her not to. I said, "It's still up?" Maggie picked up her phone and handed it to me. 47,000 views. The comments were a mixture of people laughing and people horrified. Brianna had captioned it, "Wedding morning prank on my mill, she's such a good sport." My wife standing frozen in front of a mirror, both hands on the sink, staring at her own reflection, captioned it as a good sport. I handed the phone back. I said nothing for a long time. I just sat there looking at the items spread across the bed. 11 items. 2 years. A pattern built in silence, in corners, in the spaces between family dinners and holiday photos, and a wedding I had just watched my son cry through because he was so happy. Then I said, and I said it very quietly, the way I say the things I mean most, I said she made a mistake this morning, Maggie. Maggie looked at me. I said everything else she did carefully. She was smart about it. But this morning she got comfortable, and comfortable people get careless. Maggie said, "John, I don't want a war." I said, "I know you don't." She said, "I mean it. Smith loves her." I said, "I know he does." She said, "Then what are you going to do?" I picked up the envelope. I stacked every item back inside it, carefully, neatly, in order. I folded the top down. I held it in both hands for a moment. Then I said, "I'm going to do what I should have done 2 years ago if you'd shown me this 2 years ago." She said, "Which is?" I said, "Make sure the right people see exactly who she is. Not with anger, not with accusations. Just evidence." Then she said very quietly, "She's going to say I drove her to it. She's going to make herself the victim." I stood up. I put the envelope in my briefcase. I closed the latch. I said, "Let her." Victims don't upload 47,000 view videos of the crimes they've committed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study until 4 in the morning with a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down every item in that envelope in chronological order. I wrote the dates, the context, the witnesses. I wrote what was provable and what was circumstantial. I separated what I'd seen with my own eyes from what Maggie had told me. When I was done, I had 2.5 pages. 2.5 pages of a woman carefully, strategically dismantling my wife's place in her own son's life, and doing it with a smile so wide it had square corners. I looked at those 2.5 pages, and I thought about Smith, my son who cried at his own wedding because he was so happy. My son who had no idea that the birthday card that made him feel like a good son had been written by someone else. My son who thought his mother never called on his birthday, and I made a decision, not out of anger, out of love. The most deliberate, patient, clear-eyed love I have ever practiced in my life. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you for real. Let me tell you something about patience. Most people think patience is passive. They think it means waiting, folding your hands, biting your tongue, swallowing the thing that's burning in your chest and calling that restraint. That is not patience. Real patience is a scalpel. It's knowing exactly where to cut, and having the discipline to wait until the moment is precise enough to matter. I learned that in my first year of practicing law. I have never once forgotten it. And on the morning after my son's wedding, I woke up at 6 a.m., put on a pot of coffee, and picked up my scalpel. The first call I made was to Patricia. Now, Patricia is Smith's cousin on Maggie's side. She's a quiet woman, mid-40s, works in hospital administration, and she has the kind of memory that makes her either your greatest ally or your worst nightmare, depending on which side of her you're standing on. I'd always liked Patricia. I called her at 6:15. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been expecting this call for longer than I had. I said, "Patricia, it's John." I said, "How many people in the family have seen it?" She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, then she said, "John, everyone has seen it." I said, "Good." I said, "I need you to make sure it stays visible. Don't share it yourself. Just don't let it disappear quietly. Can you do that?" Another pause. Then she said, "Consider it done." I said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said, "John, how is Maggie?" I looked across the kitchen at my wife, who was sitting at the table in her robe, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, staring out the window at the garden she'd planted the year Smith started high school. I said, "She's Maggie. She's the strongest person I've ever known, and she'll never admit it." Patricia said softly, "Tell her I love her." I said, "I will." I hung up and made my second call. The second call was to Douglas Mercer. Now, Doug is my oldest friend. 38 years. We went to law school together, survived the bar exam together, and have had standing Thursday lunch reservations at the same restaurant for the last 22 years. He is also, relevantly, one of the most respected family law attorneys in the state of Virginia. I called him at 6:30. He picked up and said, "I saw the video." I said, "Does everyone wake up knowing things before I call them?" He said, "John, it has 47,000 views. It had 47,000 views last night. It has considerably more than that this morning." I said, "How many more?" He said, "Check your phone." I pulled the phone away from my ear and opened the app. 219,000 views. The comments had shifted overnight. The laughter was gone. What remained was something considerably less forgiving. People tagging the account. People asking for names. People who had experienced similar things and were not being quiet about it. The internet, when it decides to care about something, is remarkably thorough. I put the phone back to my ear. I said, "Doug, I need an hour of your time this week." He said, "You have it. But John, before you come in, I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He said, "What's the goal here? Because there's a difference between making her uncomfortable and making this stick." I said, "I want Smith to see who he married. Clearly, without his father's fingerprints on the revelation." Doug was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the hardest kind of thing to engineer." I said, "I know. That's why I'm calling you." He said, "Thursday, noon. Don't be late." I said, "I'm never late." He said, "You were late in 1987. I said, "That was a different century, Doug." The third call I didn't make with my voice. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and composed an email. It was addressed to Brianna, not to Smith, not to both of them. To Brianna specifically, at her personal email address, which I had because she'd used it to send me a Father's Day card 18 months ago, a card I now understood in a completely different light. The email was 4 sentences long. It said, "Brianna, I hope the first morning of your marriage finds you well. I wanted to reach out personally, to let you know that I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I believe the three of us, you, Maggie, and I, should sit down together when you return from your honeymoon. There are some things I'd like to share with you that I think will be valuable for everyone going forward. Travel safely. I read it back 3 times. No accusations, no anger, no signal of what was coming. Just 4 sentences that I knew, would keep her awake for the entire 2-week honeymoon. I pressed send. Then I closed the laptop and went to make Maggie breakfast. They came back on a Tuesday. Brianna called me the morning after they landed. I'd expected her to wait, to compose herself, to rehearse. But she called at 8:47 in the morning, and her voice had the particular texture of someone who has been rehearsing since the Bahamas. She said, "John, we're back. I got your email. I'm so glad you reached out. I've actually been wanting to talk to you too." I said, "Saturday, 2 o'clock, our house." She said, "Of course, yes, absolutely." I said, "Just you and Maggie and me. Smith has plans with his college friends that afternoon." A pause. Microscopic. If I hadn't been listening for it, I'd have missed it. She said, "Oh, sure, that works." I said, "Wonderful, see you Saturday." I hung up. Maggie was standing in the kitchen doorway. She said, "She agreed?" I said, "Immediately." Maggie said, "That means she's planning something." I said, "Of course she is." Maggie said, "Doesn't that worry you?" I said, "Maggie, I have been in rooms with people planning things against me for 17 years. You know what I've learned?" She said, "What?" I said, "People who are planning something stop listening, and people who stop listening miss everything." Saturday arrived the way consequential days always do, unremarkable on the surface, sunny, mild, the kind of afternoon that has no idea what's happening inside the house it's shining on. Brianna arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. She was dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual. She'd thought about it. She came in smiling, hugged Maggie, and I watched Maggie receive that hug with the grace of a woman who has had 31 years of practice, and sat down at our dining room table like she owned the square footage. I sat across from her. Maggie sat beside me. Brianna said, "First, I just want to say about the video, it was just a bit of fun and I honestly didn't think." I said, "Brianna." She stopped. I said, "We're not here to talk about the video." She blinked. Oh, okay." I folded my hands on the table. I said, "We're here because Maggie has something she'd like you to see." I nodded to Maggie. Maggie reached beside her chair and lifted a manila folder onto the table. She set it in the center, equidistant between herself and Brianna, and she slid it forward. She didn't open it. She just slid it forward and put her hands back in her lap. Brianna looked at the folder. Then she looked at me. She said, and her voice had changed just slightly the way voices do when the performance starts costing something. She said, "What is this?" The first page was the chronological summary I'd written on my yellow legal pad, typed up cleanly, dated, formatted the way I format every document that has ever walked into a courtroom with me. Dates on the left, events on the right, witnesses noted where applicable. I watched her eyes move across the first page. Her jaw didn't drop. She was too composed for that, but her shoulders dropped approximately half an inch and did not come back up. I've cross-examined enough people to know that the shoulders never lie. She turned to the second page, the screenshots, the photograph from Christmas, the voicemail transcription, the Facebook comment traced back to her fake profile. She turned to the third page, the birthday card draft, in her own handwriting, next to a photograph of the card Smith had sent, word for word identical. She stopped turning pages. The room was very quiet. Then she did what I expected her to do. She closed the folder, lifted her chin, and said, her voice admirably steady, she said, "This isn't what it looks like. Some of this is completely out of context, and the rest of it." I said, "Brianna." She stopped again. I said, "I'm not a jury. You don't need to argue the context. That folder isn't for me." She said, "Then who is it for?" I said, "It's for Smith." The color left her face so completely and so quickly that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I said, "Now, here is what happens next. That folder goes home with you today. You decide what to do with it. You can tell Smith everything, the full story, in your own words, on your own terms. Or you can say nothing and wait for him to find it, which he will, because I intend to make sure of that." She said, "You would do that to your own son. And I want you to notice that her first instinct was not to deny. Her first instinct was to ask what I would do." I said, "I would do anything for my son, including making sure the woman he chose to spend his life with is the woman he actually thinks she is." Brianna looked at Maggie. I think she was expecting Maggie to soften it, to interject, To be, as she'd always counted on her being, the gracious one who absorbs the blow and asks everyone to please settle down. Maggie looked back at her with the most serene expression I have ever seen on a human face, and she said very gently, the way she says everything, she said, "I have loved Smith since before he could walk. I will love him long after I'm gone. But I need him to know who loves him back. I think you understand that." Brianna's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She picked up the folder. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She walked to the front door with her back very straight and her steps very measured, the way people walk when they're using their posture to hold themselves together. She opened the door. Then she stopped. She turned around and looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, every polished, calculated, square-cornered layer of her fell completely away. What was underneath was something younger and considerably less certain. She said, and her voice finally was just a voice, she said, "What if he doesn't forgive me?" I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "That's the first honest thing you've said in this house in 4 years." He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just said, "Dad, did you know?" I said, "I found out the night of your wedding." Silence. Then he said, "She said Mom knew for 2 years and never told me." I said, "Your mother knew. She didn't tell you because she loves you and she didn't want to be the reason your marriage started in a storm." More silence. Longer this time. Then Smith said, "She should have told me." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have seen it." I said, "You were in love. Love is not a character flaw, Smith." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Is Mom okay?" I looked across the living room at Maggie, who was sitting in her chair by the window, reading, her short silver hair catching the afternoon light, and somehow, against all odds, looking exactly like herself. I said, "She's okay." He said, "Tell her I'm coming Sunday." I said, "I'll tell her." I was about to hang up when he said, "Dad?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Thank you for not doing this loudly." I held the phone for a moment. Then I said, "I learned it from your mother." Brianna spent the following weeks doing what Maggie had predicted. She tried to position herself as the victim. She called family members. She sent long messages explaining context. She cried in conversations I was told about secondhand. And every single time, someone said, "But Brianna, the video. You cannot argue context against a video with 219,000 views. You cannot reframe a moment you filmed yourself, captioned yourself, and uploaded yourself." She had handed the world the only evidence it needed, with her own 2 hands, laughing. Smith and Brianna went to counseling. I won't tell you how that ends, because that part of the story belongs to them, and because some conclusions are not mine to hand you. What I will tell you is this. On a Sunday, about 6 weeks after that Saturday meeting, Smith came to the house for dinner. He sat across from Maggie at the table she had set for family dinners for 23 years. And halfway through the meal, completely unprompted, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Maggie looked down at his hand. Then she looked up at him. Then she did what Maggie does. She smiled, squeezed his hand once, and said, "Eat your food before it gets cold." Smith laughed. I laughed. And for the first time and longer than I'd realized, the table sounded exactly the way a table is supposed to sound. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one making noise. It's the one standing in the doorway, watching, and waiting for the truth to do what the truth always eventually does. It comes out. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.